Morning, all. Yep, getting off to a late start, but it's still the morning here. All right, so 32 teams. Now, I'm not going to do this in alphabetical order. I'm going to go kind of in my own order here. I've arranged them in alphabetical order, however. So, looking at all 32 teams and what the focus should be in the offseason, I thought I'd weigh in a little bit. Teams don't ask me my opinion, but I thought, I'll throw out what I think they should do. Now, of course, for the Oilers, now, to me, I think the reality is that this team was undone against Vegas in part because of depth scoring issues, 5-on-5 scoring. Now, what's interesting is the Sharks are working along with Erik Karlsson to try to facilitate a trade. So what this means is San Jose likely going to be looking for future assets, and they might take back a bad contract, right? If they can get rid of the entire cap hit, they would, I would think, absolutely take back a bad contract. But these teams could mutually help one another. So the Oilers, I do expect to be tied to any kind of rumor with Erik Karlsson. They were rumored to be in the Erik Karlsson sweepstakes before the deadline. And honestly, Karlsson might be exactly what they need. He's a 100-point producer on the blue line, but he does play like a forward. He really does. And so Karlsson and Edmonton, I do expect that to be the linkage. But if that doesn't work out, they're still going to be adding on the blue line. But I think the depth scoring issue is still there for them. Now, I want to come over to Anaheim. And I think with Anaheim, you have Pat Verbeek. Last summer, kind of standing pat, not making any big moves. This year, there's some UFAs to be that they could be moving on from. But I also think it's time for Pat Verbeek to start adding a bit. Start building the team up. They've got the number 2 draft pick. I don't know that tanking again next year would make sense. I don't like to use the word tanking too much because there are fans that get upset. We didn't tank because it sounds like it's a dishonest way of doing things. But when Anaheim had a team they knew wasn't good enough, and Verbeek was like, all right, well, we'll just kind of leave it, right? And we'll leave things as they are, and he doesn't fire Dallas Eakins till the season's over. It's pretty obvious that the plan isn't let's get a whole bunch more wins. It's more of, all right, so we know we don't have a team that's going to compete for the Stanley Cup. Let's just leave it as it is. And yeah, they obviously have some draft capital. They have some good young players, and I think this summer should be when they start adding. Now, goaltending is a question mark for numerous teams, so I want to get those out of the way first. Now, going through this alphabetically, I almost put Buffalo as goaltending being the issue. But, I mean, there's a question mark when it comes to Comrie, Levi, as well as, Luukkonen, and which one's going to be the starter and the backup and all that. But that's really, I think Devin Levi's going to be given a chance, and maybe that works out, right? And I don't think that's Buffalo's glaring need in the offseason, because I don't know if they have a glaring need in the offseason. In fact, with Buffalo, I'm going to put up here. Now, when I write this, it's always going to be with a question mark because most teams don't stand pat in the offseason, especially if they've missed the playoffs for like forever in a row, which is the case with Buffalo. But they're a really good, exciting young team. They can score goals in bunches. Their defense, I think, is underrated. Owen Power is only going to get better. Samuelson should get better as well. And so, yeah, there's a good roster there. But with goaltending, the first team alphabetically where I look at goaltending and say, is that where they need to improve? So Columbus improves their blue line, right? And I know some people don't like the Severson deal or the Provorov deal, or maybe they don't like both. But the reality is that both players improve that defense. Whether Severson's on the first pairing, second pairing, third pairing, it does improve their blue line. There's a bit of a glut of blue liners now in Columbus. I think you kind of leave that in place to the most part. I don't think you necessarily go out and start trading away young defensemen now just because of what you've added. But I do think the goaltending, it then becomes a matter of, do you believe that Elvis can bounce back next year and get to being that goaltender that he was for them at one point? And I'm on the fence a little bit on whether or not I think he can get that done. I would hope so. I would absolutely hope so. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see with Columbus what they do in the offseason and how they address that. Obviously, Tarasov is seen as the future backup, probably this year's backup. Pretty sure he'd need waivers to go down, doesn't he? So, yeah, there's some question marks there. Now, the next team where I've got goaltending, I want to get these out of the way because otherwise it just becomes me coming back and goaltending here. Detroit. So Detroit fashions themselves, I think, right now as being in the hunt for a playoff spot next year. And if they're going to be in the 2024 playoffs, I like Ville Husso, but I think they need another 1A, 1B option. And I don't think Hellberg's it. I also don't think that Nedeljkovic is going to be it either. I think that Detroit needs to look in another direction. So the goaltending carousel I did the video on weeks ago, I think Detroit's going to be involved in that, and I think they need to add a good, solid veteran goaltender. In fact, I think they should probably be in the Carter Hart sweepstakes. If Carter Hart's available from Philly, there should be a lot of teams lined up because I think Hart's going to be an excellent goaltender. He's only 24. So next team where I got goaltending, LA. So right now they have Copley. They've traded away Peterson's contract. Korpisalo's going to UFA status. Maybe you keep Korpisalo, and if they do, then goaltending's not on the board. And then you're just looking at just little additions here and there. The Kings are close. The Kings are a very good team. Solid roster top to bottom. But the goaltending does stand out as something that they're probably going to want to address. Then the next team where goaltending comes up is New Jersey. Now, I want to say straight out, too, I like Schmid. I think Vanacek is okay. But if New Jersey's going to potentially win a Stanley Cup, so New Jersey hasn't won the Cup since 2003. If 2024 they're going to end that dry spell and they're going to win a Stanley Cup, do they have a goaltender right now that you can ride through 4 rounds? And I don't know if we have the answer to that right now, but it's at least something I think they're going to have to look at in the offseason, right? Maybe you keep Vanacek, maybe Schmid's a guy that you toy around with. Maybe you keep one and you move out the other, but at any rate, the goaltending for New Jersey, when they really needed it, it did let them down against Carolina. So the next team where I've got goaltending, it should be pretty obvious. This is also why I want to get the goaltending ones out of the way, because Ottawa. Ottawa, to me, the goaltending is probably the number one thing to look at. They have the offense. They can score. I think their blue line's underrated as well. They could use a little bit of an addition on the blue line, but the goaltending to me is the issue with Ottawa as well. And that seems to be it for the goaltending side of things. All right, so Arizona, really, honestly, I think with Arizona, steady the ship. This is a franchise that now with Tempe voting no on the Tempe Entertainment District, they need to have stability both with their roster, their off-ice scenario, and all of that. This is a team that needs to show, okay, we're keeping Keller, we're keeping this team together, this good young squad, and we're going to keep building to something. They need to do that. If they do end up in a situation where Keller demands a trade, this could get, I don't know how ugly it would get, but it definitely sets them back. And this is a team that's been in a rebuild for a long time. So they need to get out of that. Boston, it's not a need. I'm not writing down a need. I'm writing this down with a question mark. What is Bergeron going to do? If Patrice Bergeron comes back, he's going to do so on a team-friendly deal, probably along the same lines as the one he just played through this past season. I'm less concerned with Krejci, although Krejci had a good year too. If Bergeron and Krejci are both gone, Boston's going to have to think things through, and they don't have a ton of cap space either to make additions. So that'll be your number 1 and number 2 centers gone, and that's a problem. Calgary. So Calgary, this is kind of like Stan Pat, but with the coaching change and with the change of general manager, do we just kind of bank on a bounce back? So you've brought in Craig Conroy as your GM, and he's got Ginla there with him, and you've got Huska behind the bench, and there's this whole new feeling in Calgary. Do you just kind of, maybe small additions, but nothing major. They didn't miss the playoffs by a lot. Do you just bet on a bounce back if you're Calgary? For the Canes, now I know they were missing Svechnikov in the playoffs, and that plays a role, but it feels like it's back-to-back seasons where they just couldn't score when they needed to in the playoffs, and it's something they need to address. I'm also going to say what I've said before, too. I think that the systems that they employ, they suppress the offense a little bit. I think Aho can do more, and I don't think he's necessarily given the free rein creatively. Maybe it's time to maybe loosen things up a little bit, get a little more scoring out of guys like Aho and Svechnikov when healthy, and go from there. Because I think Svechnikov can score 40 in a year. But again, I think the systems in Carolina really encourage the defensive aspect. And so when they get into a situation where they need a bunch of goals, sometimes they're not able to find them. Chicago, this one's pretty quick. So you draft Bedard. You draft Bedard and you go from there. I don't think Chicago is going to be competitive this year either. I think they'll be better than this past season. This past season it was kind of it'd be a shame if we got Bedard. I think that because there's not a generational talent in number one for next year's draft, at least doesn't appear that's the case. There are a few players who could go number one next year, which is completely different than this season. This season it's just Bedard. They're going to try to bring in some kind of, maybe it's not going to be Bedard. But it's totally, when you know where your parents are hiding something they got behind your back, it's in that hand. Maybe, maybe not. Yeah, no, don't fall for it. Colorado. There's two things with Colorado. So I'm cheating a bit with Colorado because there are two issues here. First off, they do need the number 2 center. They didn't really fully replace Kadri this year, and it showed, right, against Seattle and injuries and everything else too. But the fact that Landeskog, we don't know if he's going to play again, that is something they have to look at, and I think they have to address. And I think they have to approach it as if, okay, we're going to be without Landeskog for the foreseeable future, maybe beyond this coming season, and really go out and find that fix, right? The good news is he goes on LTIR, and that's where LTIR is supposed to work, right? And I don't think people are going to begrudge him for that. But yeah, they need a number 2 center, and they need to fix the fact that they don't have Gabriel Landeskog in the lineup. For Dallas, defense. I think the defense let them down. There's a lot of talk about whether or not they'll buy out Suter. I would say based on how Suter went in the playoffs, that might be a good plan. Nobody was put on waivers today, so there are no buyouts coming tomorrow. You have to put the players on waivers first before you buy them out. So I do think defense is the issue in Dallas, and that's something they're just going to have to address. There's some good defensemen there, but they need that depth as well. I think Harley needs to move up into the spot where Suter was, and they need some good veteran depth defensemen there. For Florida, they just make it all the way to the Stanley Cup final, so I'm going to go ahead and put Stan Pat for Florida as well. Basically, there are contracts that are expiring, and obviously you're going to have to replace the guys who have contracts that are expiring if you don't bring them back. But I don't think Florida's in the need for any major changes. I think they came together in the Stanley Cup playoffs. They showed how talented they are, and so I don't think there's any need for major moves with them. Minnesota. So Minnesota has issues, I would say, both on the blue line and up front. So they're going to lose Dumba. Obviously, they can't afford to keep Dumba and bring him back. So they're going to need another defenseman. They're going to need some help up front too, but it has to be low cost. So Bill Guerin's going to have to get creative this summer because of the cap penalties for their buyouts, which are absolutely awful to them this offseason and into next year as well. They need fixes that are low cost. Maybe you can get a free agent on a 1-year deal. Maybe you can get a couple of them on 1-year deals for $1 million, $1.5 million, and then bank on next year's salary cap, doing that huge upswing, and then that cap penalty won't hurt you as badly past this year. For Montreal, so this is not the same as Stan Pat. Stan Pat is basically, keep your lineup the same and, kind of bank on that things are going to work. For Montreal, you have to stay the course. They're in the midst of this rebuild, and I think it's been quite successful thus far. They've definitely got some good prospects. They're going to get a solid prospect in this year's draft as well. Whether they go with a blue liner and a guy like Reinbacher, whether they go with a forward if Will Smith's available there, whatever they do, Montreal needs to stay the course. I think they've done a good job so far with this rebuild, and it's probably another year or two before we see them building up and trying to get into a playoff spot. For Nashville, so looking at Nashville now, first off, if their players are healthy next year, that will help. They definitely missed a lot of their key guys with injury, but I do think they need some scoring depth, and that's one area that I think they can work to address that. And if they can find a team that's really looking at a cap crunch and just can't quite afford somebody, maybe Nashville picks a player up there, right? So for the Preds, I don't think they're that far off either. I think both Calgary and Nashville, who barely missed the playoffs, both teams should be optimistic about a bounce back next year. But yeah, a little bit of depth would go a long way for Nashville. For the Islanders, it's Lou Lamoriello. So I'm kind of leaning towards this anyways. But looking at their lineup, you've got Sorokin in net. You've got a really solid blue line. And you've got good forward group. Could you use a little more scoring? Sure. But I think much like coming back to Carolina, I think the systems employed by the Islanders kind of suppress the numbers for for Barzell. Barkov's in Florida. Barkov's not going to the Islanders. But Barzell, and I apologize for anybody else that I accidentally put on another team. It happens. It's not legally binding. I called Gary. So, yeah, I think the Islanders are probably going to stand pat. I think there will be little minor changes here and there. The fact that they're talking about bringing back all of the same guys who are unrestricted free agents in a couple of weeks, I think that tells you what you need to know. Lou Lamoriello doesn't think they're that far off, and we'll see how that works out for them. But I think they could use some more, a little bit of more oomph up front. Sure, maybe, but standing pat's probably the most likely thing. The Rangers. So this is an interesting one. Now, this might be resolved from within. I think the kid line, I think Capo Caco, I think Alexis Lafreniere, I think both of these players have a lot more offensive upside than what they've shown thus far. And I think that line of them with Hedel, if approached properly, can score a bunch more. So I've got scoring depth there. Because I think with the Rangers, I think there were times where if their top guys were shut down, like Panarin, like Zibanejad, they just weren't getting the scoring. But there were plenty of times, too, where that kid line was their best line this year. It didn't necessarily generate enough goals, though. So the scoring depth might be fixed by the coaching change, by a change in systems, or they may need to go out and find somebody, and so we'll see how that turns out for them. For Philadelphia, they need to just, if they're really and truly in a rebuild, and it appears that there is, future assets. Just go out, you get those future assets, you get those draft picks, and trading out, if they're going to trade out Carter Hart, I'm sure there are other veterans that are going to be on their way out of town. Whether it's this summer, whether it's at the next trade deadline, it's just going to be future assets as they go into their rebuild. For Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh, I missed this one. I would like to apologize. Goaltending. And again, this may end up being Tristan Jarry coming back. But the goaltending was definitely a problem for Pittsburgh at points. The goaltending definitely ended up costing them a playoff spot. If you look at some of the bad games that were had by DeSmith, if you looked at some of the iffy games from Jarry, solid goaltending would have meant the playoffs, and it would have bumped out Florida, and then who knows, maybe it would have been Pittsburgh that went all the way to the final. And before anybody chuckles, it's not like Pittsburgh hasn't been in the final with that core a bunch of times. So, for Pittsburgh, I think as long as Dubas gets the goaltending right, Pittsburgh should be able to bounce right back and get into it. For Seattle, I'm putting them, and again, it's always going to be a question mark, in part because I want people to weigh in on it. But with Seattle, I think standing pat's the most likely way to go. This is a team that made the playoffs in their second year. Clearly, there's something going on here. There's some good young players there. You've got Beniers. Shane Wright should be on the team next year. So far in the run for the Coachella Valley Firebirds, Wright's played 20 games. He has 2 goals and 7 assists. So he's not setting the world on fire, but in the game I watched last night, I thought he played well. I thought he had some good passing. Probably gets into their lineup next year. I don't think Seattle needs to do very much. For St. Louis, if you're a Blues fan, you probably already knew this. You've probably been saying it since the video started, and it's defense. Yeah, it's defense. Now we can have the debate about, Binnington as a starter and what kind of backup they're going to need, because obviously, with Grace leaving, they're going to need another backup. Maybe that's Hofer. How many games does Hofer play? But if the defense is still allowing all those backdoor plays, odds are your goals against is still going to stay high and your save percentage is going to stay low. So that's something they need to fix. For Tampa Bay, honestly, it's not a need on their roster as much as they need cap space. You go look at Cap Friendly, and you can see the team does not have enough cap space to bring back Killorn. They don't have enough cap space for a lot of the moves they might want to make. And so they need to free that up this summer. And there are a lot of teams in that position, but Tampa Bay's kind of in a dire position there. Now, one thing that does bode well for Tampa is they've very often been able to find those solutions within the organization. So it is possible that Tampa Bay's cap space problem means more players come up from the AHL and they end up being just fine, right? Because that seems to be the case with the Tampa Bay Lightning. They have a very good development system, and whatever they're teaching in Syracuse translates well in Tampa. For Toronto, where do you need depth? Everywhere. There are a lot of expiring contracts in Toronto, so let's just say that Bunting ends up leaving the team. They're going to need depth up front. They're going to need depth on the blue line and in net as well. I mean, if they roll with Samsonov and Wall into next year, right? This is part of the reason why people look at Toronto and say, well, Carter Hart could work there. And he could. He absolutely could. But they need depth kind of all over. The Toronto Maple Leafs, very good, solid at the top, but they need that depth. And we'll see if they bring guys back to fix that or if they look for other players, right? If they find a way to bring back O'Reilly on a team-friendly deal or something like that, or if they end up using the free agent market or the trade market to make it work. Vancouver, they have no money. None. I keep hearing, they want a third-line center. And they need a third-line center. They don't have any money. They got nothing. They're already over the cap. How do you get a third-line center and have him pay you to be on the team so you're under the cap? It doesn't happen. There's some nice guys in the NHL. They're not willing to pay a team to play them. But yeah, there's no money in Vancouver. And I do think that there's some pie in the sky dreaming from the local market when it comes to, well, they just need to trade Garland and Besser. And if they could trade Myers or, hey, what about OEL? Sure. Yeah, they're going to be, yeah, okay. So Garland, I can kind of buy that maybe a team might be interested in. I don't know if you're going to find takers for others. The JT Miller rumors seem to have settled down because Vancouver's got him in all their marketing for next year. I don't think Miller's going anywhere, and I'd be very, very surprised to see a change made there. All right, Vegas. Party. There isn't any reason to worry about the roster for next year either. Like, yeah, I mean, do they need to bring back one of the goaltenders that's on an expiring contract? Sure. Do they need to figure out what they're going to do with Leonard's contract for next year? Is he coming back? Well, we don't know. Maybe, but a party. I mean, and there's been people talking. Oh, they've been partying since they won. Yeah, because that's what happens when you win the Stanley Cup. You can party for a long time. Ask Ovechkin. The party will, I would think, continue all summer. I expect to get down there and probably find various Golden Knights on the strip, just kind of half awake, just kind of like, "Hi, I'm Alex Petrangelo. I can't find my feet." That kind of thing. Like, I expect this kind of thing, and it's fine. I mean, enjoy it because you don't know if you're going to win another one. So Vegas doesn't really have any needs. They're good. Their depth is excellent. Their depth up front, their depth on the blue line, their goaltending will be okay. And as we saw with Adin Hill, they don't need a superstar, big, highly paid goaltender to win. And I'm not saying that to say anything bad about Hill. I think Hill played very well. I also think Vegas did a good job of preventing those prime chances right in front of the net. So as long as their defense continues to do that, yeah, they got no worries. For the Capitals, trade Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov asking to go. Now his name's on the trade market. I don't know how they're going to do this because Kuznetsov's contract is pricey and his actual output has dropped. So unless they can figure out a sweetheart deal with a team like Arizona or maybe a team like Chicago where they have the cap space and they could take the contract on, and who knows, maybe Kuznetsov would go to Chicago and maybe it would work because you'd have Bedard and Kuznetsov potentially as your 1-2 down the middle. There you go. But yeah, Chicago wouldn't just take the contract on without maybe you throw in a pick. So for Washington, a team that's looking to bounce back and get back into the playoffs next year, and I think that's going to be the plan, moving Kuznetsov is probably the right way to go. And then you'd be looking at trying to replace him as the number 2 center, and whether you could do that from within or not, whole other conversation. But yeah, trading Kuznetsov I think is important. Now that we know he has to be traded, I do think that's a big thing. And then in Winnipeg, they're going to be the most interesting team to watch. When I was interviewed on Team 1050 or TSN 1050, and asked whether or not Winnipeg would be the most interesting team once the Stanley Cup final was decided, and the answer is yes. I think there's a major shakeup coming to Winnipeg. Now, what's interesting is they want to make these changes and stay in the playoffs. They want to stay competitive and they still want to be a playoff team. So they want that major shakeup, but if they're going to stay in the playoffs, they have to be hockey trades. I love hockey trades. I absolutely love when a team says, we need this, you need this. I think we can work something out and make that deal happen. The salary cap has kind of made trades boring. I will admit that. Salary cap has made trades pretty boring because very often it's, well, they're the only team with the cap room, so they're going to have to get that player. Oh, look, they got that player. They were the only team with cap space. But the reality is that Winnipeg needs to make changes. Rick Bowness, the way that he tore into the team after they lost in the first round, you have to make major changes after that. You can't just all get back together in September and go, man, that was weird, wasn't it? Everybody forget what I said? Good. Yeah, no. So, let me know your thoughts. What do you think that the team, maybe the team you root for, maybe the team you can't stand, what do they need most in this offseason, and what should their focus be, right? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.